Good morning. We come to the last of these hard sayings of Jesus that are hard to hear. And this morning we look at love your enemies. And our scripture reference is Luke 6, the 27th chapter through 36 verses. But I say to you who are willing to hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. If someone takes your coat, don't withhold your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks, and don't demand your things back from those who take them. Treat people in the same way that you want them to treat you. But if you love those who love you, why should you be commended? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, why should you be commended? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, why should you be commended? Even sinners lend to sinners expecting to be paid back in full. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expect nothing in return. If you do, you will have a great reward. You will be acting the way children of the Most High act, for He is kind to ungrateful and wicked people. Be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. There is a lot in this, more than just dealing with the statement of love your enemies. A lot to unpack there. William Barclay comments in his commentary that there is no commandment of Jesus which calls so much discussion and debate than this commandment to love your enemies. And to start to get inside of it, we have to understand this word love. Now, I've mentioned this before, that the Greek language is a very rich language, a very expressive language, and our English language is somewhat constrained in matching the expressions that you have in the Greek. There are many words in the Greek, multiple words, that we translate as one word in the English language. And love happens to be one of those words. There are, the phrase here is to love, that Barclay deals with, that we have three expressions of that. There is aran, which is a passionate love. And it is from that in the pure word love by itself that we get the eros, the sexual love. And then there is the philane, the love for the nearest and dearest. It's a warm affection that you have for those that are close to you. And from that we get phili, which is brotherly love, for which Philadelphia is named, the city's Philadelphia. And then we have agapan. And Barclay says that it takes a whole paragraph to explain this, so I'm not going to try to paraphrase it. I'm going to share with you William Barclay's commentary here. It says that agapan describes an active feeling of benevolence towards the other person. It means that no matter what that person does to us, we will never allow ourselves to desire anything but his highest good. And we will deliberately and of set purpose go out of our way to be good and kind to him. This is most suggestive. We cannot love our enemies as we love our nearest and dearest. To do so would be unnatural, impossible, and even wrong. But we can see to it that no matter what a man does to us, even if he insults, ill-treats, and injures us, we will seek nothing but his highest good. One thing that emerges from this, the love we bear for our dear ones, is something that we cannot help. We speak of falling in love. It is something which happens to us. But this love towards our enemies is not only something of the heart, it is something of the will. It is something which, by the grace of Christ, we may will ourselves to do. And he goes on to talk about Christian ethic. And the main point that he makes there is that the Christian ethic is positive. In other words, it's an active, not a passive, that you're to do something, as opposed to not do something, which is a negative ethic. And in the Ten Commandments, they are, as Pastor Don pointed out last week, they are phrased, they're grouped, the first four being our relationship with God, and the remaining six being our relationship with each other. And most of them are phrased as do not. This is something you will not do. Except the one that we looked at last week was to honor your father and mother, and something that you do, and that is what Barclay is putting forth here. This idea of loving your enemies, coming from the Gospel of Luke, needs to be put into the there's a scene, I guess a backdrop that you need to put behind this, and that is the Gospel of Luke and its writing was, Luke holds up in his gospel that Jesus is reaching out, and God's love and Jesus' ministry mainly is to those that are oppressed and outcast, those that are on the outside looking in. People in more modern times we'd say they're from the other side of the tracks, as opposed to where the rich and the poor division there. And his gospel being said in that light, this love your enemies, has two groups of people that rise up as candidates for being your enemies. The first being the government officials, the Roman government. And Luke goes to great pains to show that Christianity is not a threat to the Roman government, but Christianity, as we see in Acts, was also oppressed by the Roman government. And so in Jesus' ministry, the government itself would have been one of those categories of people to be enemies. The other category would be the the religious leaders, the rabbis, the priests, the Sadducees, who were deciding how people would live with each other, what was right and what was wrong. I don't remember if it was last week or the week before that Pastor Don mentioned that there were 600 and some commandments that were written down. There were as many or more that were unwritten, that were verbally held and passed among each other, that people were to obey. And so that's just, I say that to illustrate the impact that the religious leaders had on the population as a whole. So these are two groups of people that would be candidates for being your enemies. And Jesus is holding up that we should love them. Now we see in Jesus' treatment when he comes in contact with the governmental leaders, we can see this agape type of love that Jesus expressed towards them. The way that the exchanges in the Gospels are between Jesus and the religious leaders, I have a little bit more trouble seeing that there. And I think that the Gospel writers, we lose something in not being able to be there and to see the facial expressions of Jesus as he's having these interactions, the tone of his voice as he's interacting to the tone of the voice in itself would convey a great deal in how he's interacting with these people there.
I have a question.
Go.
Okay. Today, the political leaders are so far removed from the people, the general population. I'm not talking about the guys that meet across the street. I'm talking about, the country's leaders. They're so far removed from the people. How do you consider them your enemies or your friends? And if you consider them your enemies, how do you deal with them? How do you feel about them? Do you understand what I'm even talking about?
Yeah. My answer would be that we deal with them the same way that we would deal with somebody who is up close and personal. And I guess I can illustrate that from personal experience in that when I worked for Xerox, I've shared this before, there was one account that the man who owned the business, who ran the business, was just not a pleasant individual to be around. He was very abusive, very authoritative in the way that he dealt with people. And he was so unpleasant to be around. I was the primary service rep for this account, but we worked as a co-op, my fellow co-workers, that we take the service calls in the order that they came in, and you didn't always work on the machines that you were assigned personal responsibility to. But my co-workers so didn't like going into this account that when his service calls came in, they would come and relieve me from what I was working on so that I had to go and deal with him. And one day, he didn't like, one of the many times that he didn't like what I was telling him, and he told me in no uncertain and unpleasant, very unpleasant terms, to get out and not come back into his place of business. And I told him that I would do that, but he had to understand that part of his equipment, I was the only service rep west of Richmond that was trained on it. In fact, there was only one other person in the state trained on it, and he was in Richmond. The only reason I was trained on it was because he had the equipment there in his shop. And he didn't respond to that. And I left there and went to talk to my manager, and the sales rep happened to be there also. And Carl, the sales rep, was part of a Bible study that I took part in. And I asked Carl, I said, what are we going to do about, and I called this guy by name. He's still a businessman in Roanoke, so I won't name him, but what are we going to do about him? And his reply was, I don't know. Even though Carl was his sales rep and sold equipment to him, he didn't treat Carl much better than he treated me. And then Carl said, wait a minute, I do know one thing we can do, and that's that we can pray for him. He didn't say pray about him, we can pray for him. And I have to admit that never occurred to me. But I started to include this man by name in my daily prayers, in my morning prayers as I was on my way to work. I had discovered that my radio had an off button, and I could use that 45 minutes driving to Roanoke as a time of prayer. And I started including that. And our relationship changed. I can't say I enjoyed going in there any more than I used to. I still didn't like it, because he was just a generally disagreeable person. Um, but our relationship changed. And I've understood that to be that I started to seek something for him, rather than something for myself in mediating that relationship. And I don't know whether that answers your question or
Well,
not.
just suppose there was someone running for president who you really didn't like. Are you gonna pray he loses?
I would suspect, I would say that what Jesus is asking us to do here is to pray for his well-being. Pray for his soul. And there's another thought that comes to my mind. Years ago, a lady gave me a little brass plaque, and it's a quotation from, I believe, Joshua, that says the battle, the battle is the Lord's, indicating that that God is the one fighting the wars, fighting the battles. Our part in it is to be faithful and to pray. And
For Putin.
pray for his well-being. Not that he'll succeed.
Pray for a change of heart.
I think the question that you pose indicates or goes to the heart of why Barclay says that this commandment has sparked more discussion and comment than any of the other commandments that Jesus gave us. Because it more than any of the other that Pastor Don is dealing with, this one's really, really, really hard. In the situations that we have to deal with there.
Because it's so easy to slip into, it has to go affect me.
Yeah,
And the prayer might end up being about ourselves rather than for the other person, which Jesus didn't want, I don't think. And that passage about that is kind of like what's in James about faith without works.
mm-hmm.
You know, what good is it you tell somebody to go be warm but don't give them clothes, or be full and not hungry but they don't give them any food to help them along the way, that type of thing. So, and when you read that scripture, it kind of remind me of the Beatitudes. It's on that, you know,
Yeah.
one and the other. It's kind of like lined up, kind of like the Beatitudes, only in a different version and about a different idea. But it's, you do this, do this, do this to achieve the end result that you want or ask for.
Yeah. It's the way the gospel writers were able to pick and choose from information about Christ, either from, as in Mark's gospel, where we have the writer being, or the source being Peter, who had that direct access to Christ. John, who may or may not have been the Apostle John, but then Matthew and Mark, Matthew and Luke, who are writing to groups of people to get a specific point across. So they were picking and choosing the information that they were using, and it's sort of like taking it out of context of how Jesus was actually conveying this. There's truth there that we struggle to understand, but sometimes I think that truth would be a little bit easier to understand, to be in the context of how Christ was actually uttering those words, and we don't know that.
you had talked about enemies, and you identified the Roman government and Jewish leadership as enemies. And I think what helps me whittle that down is to say, really, who are my enemies? And if you sit there and think about it, it's more about relationships that you create. You know, I don't like that person, not as opposed to an enemy that's attacking you. So, but in there it says, you read it said bad things to you, insults you, or takes your stuff, right? So I have to think about that. You know, if you just keep it in that smaller context.
Well, yeah, but that's not all your life is. Your life isn't in this little context. Your
Well,
life
I'm
is
just
all-
thinking about identifying my enemies, right? You just keep
I-
it, you know, to that element, and you really don't have this huge, I guess, huge world of enemies to deal with.
Well, I don't feel that way. I feel like, I'm trying not to be political.
Oh, I understand.
I feel like Alexander Putin is my enemy, because if he wins, that's another country down that's gonna be communist.
Mhm.
And communism wants to, I mean, that's what they want, take over the world, they've said it, that's in their, whatever. So, I don't think that, I think when Jesus says the government, I think he means the government.
Well, Jesus didn't say that. I put that in there.
What did he say? Love your enemies.
Right.
Well-
I was just posing, there are two categories of people that could be seen as enemies.
Well, I agree with you, and I think Alexander Putin is my enemy.
I'm not disagreeing, I just didn't want you to put those words into Christ's mouth, because he didn't say that here.
Well, if you think about it, not all government leaders are enemies. Some of them do a lot of good. And just like Herod, he didn't want to condemn Jesus, put him to death. Said, you know, I don't see no fault with him. But the Jewish leaders kept pressing him to, you know, do something, because they were afraid of Jesus undermining them and dismantling the Jewish hierarchy, more or less. You know, putting them out of a job. So
Yeah.
that was their enemy, was Jesus. And Jesus' enemy was the failure of people to accept what he was trying to tell them, the new interpretation of the gospel, and come to the Father through him, not just through rabbis and the Pharisees and all this type of thing. But
Well, we could go on for a long time here, but we need to move on, and hope that you'll be with us as Pastor Don deals with this difficult saying later on in worship today. And again, I wanted to invite you two things. If you know of people who might enjoy these discussions, feel free to pass the link on to them and have them join us that way. And if you'd like to join us at the table, we meet here at the church in the Carpenters of Faith classroom try to start at 9:15 and for about 15 minutes. Sometimes, like today, we run a little bit longer, but we'd be happy to have you sit at the table with us. And may God's blessings be upon you.